Start that 70-year-old engine, and the tugboat is yours." Corinne Vale said it through a harbor loudspeaker, smiling down from the polished steel platform of Vale Atlantic Shipworks as 200 fishermen, welders, tourists, and dockhands turned toward the oldest vessel in Port Barlow. The tugboat sat low against Pier 6, 58 feet of faded red steel and peeling cream trim. Maribel could still be read across her stern beneath gull droppings and 20 Maine winters. A yellow scrap hold tag hung from the wheelhouse rail. Beyond her, an excavator waited on a barge with its sheer jaws open. Daniel Mercer did not look at the crowd. He set his palm on the tug's warm gray engine room hatch and felt a faint tremor moving through the deck. Not machinery, tied against the hull. Beside him, his 14-year-old son, Caleb, stared at Corinne. "She means it?" Daniel crouched, lifted the hatch 2 inches, and smelled old diesel, salt, wet iron, and something sharper, ether. He let the hatch settle shut. "No starting fluid," he said. Corinne lowered the microphone. Her navy coat looked as if it had never brushed against rust. "Excuse me? If someone has been spraying ether into that old Detroit, nobody does it again. Not while I'm responsible for it." A few retired fishermen stopped smiling. They knew what ether could do to an old 2-stroke diesel with tired rings and an unknown blower. Corinne's grin tightened. "You haven't even seen the engine." "I saw the empty cans under the ladder." Daniel pointed through the scupper. 3 silver aerosol cans lay among rust flakes below the hatch. "And I can smell the 4th one." The harbor crowd shifted. 30 seconds earlier, Daniel had been the grease-stained mechanic Corinne had dragged into a publicity stunt. Now, men who had worked diesels since before Caleb was born were leaning toward him. Corinne brought the microphone back up. "Then let me make the offer simple enough for everyone. Mr. Mercer has spent the morning telling my survey crew that Maribel's engine should not be cut apart for scrap. I say it has been frozen since 2009. If he starts it by noon Monday, on its own fuel system, the vessel belongs to him." It was Friday, 9 minutes past noon. 3 days, someone called. 3 days, Corinne repeated. "But if he fails, he pays the berth charge and signs a statement that Vale Atlantic's scrap decision was sound." That last part was the blade hidden inside the joke. The berth charge was $2,400 a day. Daniel's garage checking account held $4,912. His mortgage payment was due Tuesday. Corinne knew it. Vale Atlantic had bought the waterfront parcel where Mercer Marine and Auto had rented a 2-bay shop for 11 years. Her company could decide whether his lease survived the fall. Caleb looked up at his father. Daniel saw the question, and the fear behind it. He turned to Corinne. "I need 3 things. 72 hours, 1 sealed 55-gallon drum of clean diesel, and from the moment we sign, nobody touches that engine except me and my son." "Your son?" "He labels parts and keeps the log. He doesn't operate machinery." "Anything else?" "The test has to be safe. It starts, idles for 10 minutes, takes cooling water, builds oil pressure, then turns the propeller against the dock lines at a head idle. If I find a condition that can hurt somebody or destroy the engine, I stop. You don't get to call safety a failure." Corinne laughed once, but Daniel watched the harbor master, Len Cormier, nod. "Put it in writing," Daniel said. That drew the loudest reaction yet. Corinne's company attorney was already on the platform. She glanced at him, then at the cameras from the local station. Vale Atlantic was announcing a new patrol vessel contract that morning. She could not retreat from her own show without looking afraid of a dead tugboat. "Gladly," she said. 23 minutes later, Daniel and Caleb read every line. Failure meant $7,200 in berth charges. Success meant Maribel transferred for $1. Daniel added that any interference by Vale Atlantic, its employees, contractors, or agents would trigger immediate transfer plus $75,000 in damages. "I have no intention of helping him," Corinne said, and signed. Len witnessed the signatures. Daniel drew timed red paint lines across the hatch, fuel fill, air covers, and doors, then had Caleb photograph every seal. "You always this suspicious?" Corinne asked. "Only when somebody bets me something she plans to cut up." Then he opened the hatch. The engine room was cramped, dark, and filmed with the brown dust of abandoned machinery. At its center stood a General Motors Detroit diesel, 6 to 110, 6 cylinders in a long green block, with 2-stroke airboxes and a roots blower mounted along its side. The paint had gone black above the exhaust manifold. Copper cooling lines wore pale green crust. A pair of 24-volt starter motors hung at the flywheel housing like clenched fists. Daniel rested his hand on the valve cover. His father had worked on a 6 to 110 in a quarry generator when Daniel was 12. He remembered the sound before he remembered the lessons, a hard, even bark that settled into a deep hammering rhythm, each combustion pulse traveling through the floor and up a boy's legs. Caleb aimed his flashlight. Can it run? Daniel wiped a thumb across the governor linkage. Beneath the dust was a narrow, bright streak. Something in here has moved recently. Is that good? It means we don't assume anything. He began with the rule that had kept his hands attached to his wrists for 40 years. Make it unable to start before asking it to move. He disconnected both battery leads, shut the tank valve, and removed the inspection covers from the airbox. Caleb placed every bolt into labeled paper cups. One read port air box, another read starter cables. Daniel pushed a flexible bore scope through the first opening and turned the engine by hand with a boring tool on the flywheel. At first, it did not move. Corinne, watching from the pier with 6 executives, lifted her eyebrows. Daniel did not pull harder. He backed off, oiled the barring gear, and tried the other direction by a fraction. The flywheel shifted with a dry groan, then stopped. Caleb whispered, "Frozen?" Daniel held up one finger. He removed the rocker cover and found that 2 exhaust valves were held open by old carbon and varnish. Forcing the crank would have driven a piston against a valve that could not return. He worked each valve with penetrating oil and the smooth end of a brass drift, never striking the stem. The first freed after 6 minutes. The second took 20. When both springs returned evenly, he barred the engine again. The flywheel rolled 3 teeth, then 6, then a full turn. A retired lobsterman named Gus Harlan leaned over the rail. "That block ain't seized." Daniel looked at the thin film squeezed from a bearing feed line. It was black, but there were no metal flakes in it. "Not seized," he agreed. "Not ready either." Corinne checked her watch. 71 hours. Daniel ignored her. He removed all 6 injector assemblies, laid them in order on a clean board, and covered the open bores. The injectors were old unit types, mechanically actuated, each one responsible for metering and pressurizing fuel at its cylinder. 5 nozzles were crusted. The 6th was strangely clean. Caleb noticed the difference. Somebody replaced that one? Or cleaned it? Daniel turned it beneath the work light. Fresh wrench marks crossed the hold-down nut. Recently, he checked its control rack. It stuck halfway toward full fuel. If the engine had caught on ether with that injector jammed, it could have oversped before the governor pulled the rack back. On a 70-year-old diesel with unknown bearings, that could throw steel through the engine room wall. Daniel carried the injector to the hatch and held it up where Corinne could see. Someone tried to make it start without checking whether it could stop. Corinne folded her arms. People have tried to start that engine for years. This nut was marked this week. Can you prove who touched it? Don't need to. I only need to undo what they did. That answer denied her the argument she wanted. Daniel went back below. By 3, Daniel had built a shielded hand-operated injector test rig. 3 injectors dribbled, 2 opened unevenly, and the clean one delivered too much fuel, without shutting cleanly. That the whole problem? Caleb asked. One problem. Guessing at the rest could kill the engine. Daniel cleaned the nozzles, lapped sealing faces, checked spring pressure, and freed every rack. Caleb logged each result. On retest, the first injector produced a fine mist and snapped shut without a tail. Gus grinned. That's how rain ought to look if rain cost $5 a gallon. At 5, Wade Pike, Vail Atlantic's operations chief, denied Daniel shore power, wash water, the crane, and every yard tool not named in the agreement. "You told me what I don't have," Daniel said. "Saves time." He called Gus, not an attorney. Soon, fishermen arrived with a transfer pump, boat batteries, hose, water cans, and harbor lanterns. No miracle parts. Only ordinary things working people lent one another. Corinne surveyed the pickups. "You turned my shipyard into a flea market." "Your shipyard stopped at the fence. The harbor didn't." She glanced at Caleb's log. "A school night in an engine room. Father of the year." Daniel stood. "He leaves at 9. He wears protection. He lifts nothing he can't control. And he's learning to read a promise before trusting who made it." Caleb's shoulders straightened. "That pier must be clear Monday for my steel delivery," Corinne said. "Then you'd better hope I win." At 9, Daniel drove Caleb to the apartment above their garage. A customer's transmission waited unfinished in one bay. The other was empty, because Vail Atlantic had blocked waterfront access. A mortgage envelope lay on the kitchen table. If it doesn't start, we lose 7,200? Caleb asked. Yes. Then why take the bet? Because the engine wasn't dead. People stopped asking it the right questions. Daniel sat across from him. I knew the first safe step. Tomorrow we earn the next one. You never pretend you know the ending. You make the next step honest. At 5:30 Saturday morning, father and son returned to Pier 6. The red witness marks were intact. Daniel checked every one before opening anything. He drained a cup from the tug's day tank. Water filled the bottom third. Rust and black biological sludge floated above it. The old fuel was unusable. He isolated the tank, connected the sealed drum Corinne had provided to a temporary supply and return loop, and fitted 2 filters in series. The first was coarse and clear. The second was fine enough to protect the injector plungers. Then he examined the engine's lubrication system. The dipstick showed oil, but its level was too high, and it smelled of diesel. Fuel had leaked down past an injector or transfer pump seal over years of failed starting attempts, thinning the lubricant. He opened the drain valve. Nearly 12 gallons of black oil ran into containers. Silver did not glitter in it. That was good. A ribbon of water appeared at the end. That was not. Caleb held up the flashlight. Head gasket? Maybe. Or condensation. Or the oil cooler. Daniel pressure tested the freshwater side with a hand pump at low pressure. The gauge dropped 1 pound in 10 minutes. He listened along the block, then opened an oil cooler drain. A green bead formed where no green bead belonged. The cooler core had a pinhole leak. It was the second hard stop. Running the engine with that leak could put coolant into the bearings and oil into the cooling circuit. A full replacement core could take a week. Wade Pike appeared at the rail as if summoned by bad news. Problem? Daniel showed him the bead. Looks terminal, Wade said. Looks like a tube. The cooler used a bundle of small copper-nickel tubes inside a shell. Daniel removed the end cap and tested each tube with low air pressure and soapy water. One produced a necklace of bubbles near its center. He did not have time to replace the bundle, but marine engineers had isolated failed cooler tubes for generations. Daniel cleaned the leaking tube ends and drove a tapered brass plug into each side, taking one tube out of service while leaving the rest functional. It reduced cooling capacity by less than 2%, acceptable for an unloaded dock test, not for towing. He wrote, "Temporary test repair" in Caleb's log, and tied a red tag to the cooler. Wade tapped the tag. So you admit it isn't fixed. I admit exactly what it is. Safe for the agreed test, not cleared for service. Mrs. Vale said the engine had to run, and I said I wouldn't fake a restoration in 3 days. Wade's mouth tightened. You mechanics always leave yourselves an exit. Daniel looked at him. A safety limit isn't an exit. It's how people go home. By noon, the cooler held pressure. Daniel filled the crankcase with fresh 40-weight diesel oil purchased on his own account. It cost $680, more than the profit from the van job waiting in his garage. He paid without telling Caleb how close the debit card came to declining. He removed the lower inspection covers and used a pre-lube pump to push oil through the main galleries before turning the crank again. At first, the pressure gauge barely moved. He checked the pump, reversed 2 fittings, and tried again. Oil emerged at 5 rocker points. Not the 6th. The rear rocker shaft was dry. Daniel traced its feed passage and found an old leather fiber washer folded over an oil hole beneath a banjo fitting. Someone had installed the wrong washer years ago. It had covered half the port, then hardened there. The rear cylinder had been starved of top-end oil every time anyone cranked the engine. Caleb photographed the crescent-shaped imprint. Could that stop it from starting? Eventually, it could stop it forever. Daniel cut a correct copper washer from sheet, annealed it with a small torch on the pier, quenched it, and reassembled the feed. On the next pre-lube cycle, oil rose at all 6 rocker assemblies. It spilled in equal amber lines, bright against the black head. The men watching from the pier understood that image without a lecture. 6 places, 6 flows, 1 problem removed. Gus nodded. She's waking up. Daniel did not say it. He had learned not to give a machine credit for work it had not done. At 2, he inspected the roots blower. A 2-stroke Detroit needed the blower to move scavenging air through the cylinders. Without it, the engine was not merely weak, it could not breathe. The rotors turned, but one lobe had a polished edge where it had almost touched the housing. He measured end clearance with feeler gauges, tight but usable cold. Then he found the cause. One engine mount had collapsed, twisting the block enough to pull the blower drive out of line. Replacing the mount required lifting several thousand pounds. Vale Atlantic had denied him the crane. For the first time, Daniel sat down. His back rested against the engine room bulkhead. Sweat cooled beneath his shirt despite the October air. Above him, the pier carried footsteps, gull cries, and the clang of the new shipyard going about its paid work. Caleb lowered himself beside him. Is this the one we can't get past? Could be. What happens if you shim it? Daniel looked at him. I saw the brass shims under the other mounts, Caleb said quickly. I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm asking. Daniel took the flashlight and studied the mount again. The rubber element had not separated. Its steel base had sunk into a rusted section of bed rail, changing the angle. A proper repair meant cutting out the rail and welding new steel. But for a stationary test, he could unload that corner with a mechanical jack, place a measured steel bearing plate over sound rail, and restore alignment without pretending the corrosion was repaired. Good question, he said. Caleb tried not to smile too much. They borrowed 2 screw jacks from Gus, rated well beyond the corner load. Daniel built cribbing from solid oak blocks, inspected each one, and placed them where a failure could not trap a hand. He set a dial indicator against the blower coupling. Caleb watched the needle while Daniel raised the engine 1/16 of an inch at a time. 2/1000ths, Caleb called. Daniel adjusted the opposite jack. 1. Another fraction. Needles steady. Daniel slid in the steel plate, lowered the mount onto it, and rechecked. The blower rotated without the polished lobe approaching the housing. He tied a second red tag. Temporary alignment for no-load test. Hull bed repair required before service. By the time the sun dropped behind the cannery, the crowd had stopped calling the work a bet. They called it the start. At 7 Saturday evening, Corinne returned with a marine insurer. Daniel was rebuilding the rusted emergency shutdown cable that should have driven all 6 injector racks to no fuel. Its lever had been wired open. That was done before we owned the vessel, Corinne said. Probably. It still decides whether I turn the starter. Daniel installed a manual trip beside the engine. Caleb pulled it while Daniel moved the governor. All 6 racks snapped to stop. They repeated the test from the wheelhouse and engine room before Daniel trusted it. Corinne checked her watch. 41 hours. When will you attempt to start? When it has cooling water, oil pressure, clean fuel, and a shutdown I trust. Not tonight. My steel delivery arrives Monday. A delay pushes sea trials and payroll. This is not a parable to me. It was her first honest sentence. Then let me finish, Daniel said. If Maribel runs, Gus can shift her to Len's east wall berth before your barge arrives. Corinne glanced at Caleb and the red repair tags. And if you fail, I pay what I signed. Can you? Daniel did not answer. Her expression told him she already knew. At 9, he sealed the engine room again and drove Caleb home. They slept 4 hours. At 2 in the morning, Daniel woke to rain hammering the apartment windows and a feeling he could not name. He checked the phone beside his bed. No call, no message. Then he saw the live image from a small battery camera Gus had mounted on his own pickup facing Pier 6. Daniel had not hidden it. The camera sat behind the windshield in plain view, a theft deterrent Gus used during lobster season. On the screen, a hooded figure crossed the pier carrying a tool bag. Daniel was out of bed before the image refreshed. He called Len, then Gus. He did not call Corinne. Rain turned Dock Street silver beneath his headlights. Caleb came down the stairs pulling on his jacket. Stay here, Daniel said. I keep the log. You also stay out of a confrontation at 2 in the morning. Caleb stopped. He hated it, but he nodded. Daniel reached Pier 6 in 6 minutes. Len's harbor truck arrived from the other direction. The hooded figure was gone. The red paint line across the engine room hatch looked intact. Len swept his flashlight over it. Maybe he never got in. Daniel crouched. Rain beaded on the paint. At the rear hinge, the pin had been driven halfway out. Someone had lifted the hatch from that side without breaking the seal at the latch, opening a gap barely large enough for an arm and a tool. Photograph it before we touch anything, Daniel said. They documented the hinge, the footprints, and a short, bright scratch on the coaming. Len called the county deputy because trespass at an industrial dock was not something to improvise around. When Corinne arrived 20 minutes later, she was furious. You brought police into my yard? Harbor master did, Daniel said. Somebody entered the vessel. Your seal is intact. He pointed to the hinge. Wade Pike arrived behind her. Rain ran from the edge of his yellow slicker. He did not look at the hinge. He looked at the camera in Gus's pickup. Daniel noticed. The deputy asked everyone to remain on the pier, while Daniel and Len inspected the engine room. Daniel opened the hatch normally and went down first. Nothing looked disturbed. The tool board was complete. The temporary fuel drum remained sealed at its cap. Battery leads were disconnected. Injector lines were tight. Then Daniel's light reached the narrow space behind the fuel filter bracket. A black rubber supply hose showed a fresh, wet shine. He did not touch it. He photographed it from 3 angles. Someone had cut halfway through the underside where the damage could not be seen from above. At suction, the hose might not leak fuel outward. It would draw air inward. The engine could start, run long enough to raise hope, then lose fuel and die under load. To the crowd, it would look like Daniel had failed to clean the system or diagnose the pump. More dangerous, the blade had nicked the adjacent copper return line. Vibration could finish the crack and spray fuel across the hot exhaust. Len let out a slow breath. That's no prank. Daniel thought of Caleb leaning over the log while the engine ran. His hands became very still. He climbed to the pier and faced Corinne. Someone cut the supply hose and damaged the return line. That is an accusation, Corinne said. It is an inspection result. Any one of your new friends could have done it to trigger your penalty clause. Gus stepped forward, but Daniel held up a hand. Let's watch the recording, he said. They gathered beneath the harbor office awning. Gus opened the camera file on a tablet. The rain blurred parts of the image, but the pier lights showed the figure arrive from Vail Atlantic's locked fabrication yard, not from the public harbor gate. He moved with a slight hitch in his right step. At the tug, he raised his left hand. A Vail Atlantic access badge flashed white on his sleeve. When he turned beneath the lamp, the hood fell back. Wade Pike's face filled the screen for 2 seconds. No one spoke. Wade looked at Corinne. I was checking the seal. The video continued. It showed him removing the hinge pin, lifting the hatch, reaching into the engine room with his tool bag, and working for 4 minutes. Corinne's face changed by degrees. First, disbelief. Then, calculation. Then, the realization that every calculation was happening in front of the same fishermen and workers she had invited to witness Daniel's humiliation. The deputy asked Wade to step aside. Corinne turned on Daniel. The contract says interference. It does not prove I ordered it. Daniel took the folded agreement from the waterproof pouch in his tool bag. It says employees, contractors, or agents. Not acts personally ordered by the CEO. Your attorney wrote that part. The company attorney, now standing beneath an umbrella at the edge of the awning, read the clause and said nothing. Then you have your boat, Corinne said. Take it. The test is over. Daniel folded the agreement again. No. Her eyes narrowed. No. The penalty settled ownership. It didn't answer whether Maribel can run. You would risk an engine you now own to continue a wager you already won? I'm not continuing your wager. I'm finishing my work. Gus looked toward the tug. Len did too. The crowd had grown despite the hour, drawn by messages and pickup headlights. Men and women in raincoats stood along the fence. Vail Atlantic night shift welders watched from inside the yard. Caleb arrived with Mrs. Harlan at 4. He stopped beside Daniel and stared at Wade being placed in the deputy's car. He cut it? He cut it. So we won? Daniel looked at Maribel. We own the chance to finish. Caleb absorbed that. What about the $75,000? That goes first to making the vessel safe. Then to the berth fee reserve, insurance, and the shop. You could just sell the tug. Could. Are you going to? Daniel watched rain run down the cream wheelhouse and over the faded name. Let's hear what she has to say before we decide what she is. Corinne heard him. She said nothing. At dawn, she suspended Wade and ordered her attorney to acknowledge the transfer and damages in writing. It was not an apology. It was containment, but it removed her company from the engine room and placed Len in control of the access log. Daniel replaced the cut rubber hose with a marine-rated section Gus bought from a chandlery at First Light. He did not splice the nicked copper return. He removed the damaged length, flared a new copper-nickel section, added proper vibration loops, and pressure-tested it above normal transfer pressure. The repair consumed 5 hours they had not planned to spend. Sunday's deadline ticked visibly on a chalkboard beside the pier. 29 hours. Daniel moved to the cooling circuit. The tug's raw water seacock was corroded shut, and forcing it could open a leak below the waterline. The pump impeller had also taken a permanent set. No replacement in town matched it, and Daniel refused to trim a near fit that might shed rubber into the heat exchanger. Instead, He built a temporary cooling supply from 2 livestock tanks, Gus's pump, a regulator, and heavy hose. The discharge returned visibly to the second tank. The insurer approved it for the stationary test and marked the old seacock, "Do not operate." "What if the pump quits?" Caleb asked. Daniel pointed to the exposed return stream. "We see it stop, and I shut down. Never hide the thing that tells you whether your safety system is alive." Caleb wrote that in the margin of the log. At 2 Sunday afternoon, Daniel filled the closed loop with coolant and pressurized it again. It held. He barred the engine through 2 full revolutions with the injectors installed but held at no fuel. Compression rose and fell evenly enough to push against his shoulders. One cylinder felt softer. He stopped at each top position and listened through the airbox ports. Cylinder 4 hissed more than the rest. A burned valve could end the attempt. So could broken rings. Daniel performed a low-pressure leak test and found air escaping through the exhaust, not the crankcase. The exhaust valve was sealing poorly. He removed the rocker and inspected the bridge. A ridge of carbon held the valve a few thousandths open. Full head removal would take more time than they had. Daniel cleaned the accessible stem, worked the valve gently, and adjusted the lash to specification. The hiss diminished but did not disappear. "Will it fire?" Gus asked. 5 cylinders can carry the first seconds. If 4 joins them after it warms, we're good. If its exhaust temperature stays cold, we shut down and pull the head later. "You're willing to run it with a leak?" Corinne asked. A measured compression loss is not the same as metal contact or no lubrication. We monitor each exhaust port with an infrared thermometer. We stop if the cylinder doesn't contribute or temperature rises unevenly. She looked toward the insurer, who nodded once. Corinne said, "You have an answer for everything." "No, I have a stop point for everything." At 4, the repaired injectors went in. Daniel connected the clean temporary fuel loop and worked the hand primer. Diesel filled the first clear filter, then the second. He opened the bleed screw at the transfer pump until bubbles disappeared. Then he loosened each injector line and rolled the engine on the starters with the racks at no fuel, first confirming oil pressure. The borrowed batteries pulled the old starters slowly. The flywheel turned 1 laborious revolution, then another. The oil gauge climbed to 8 pounds. Daniel stopped after 10 seconds to protect the starters. He touched each cable connection. The starboard starter terminal was hot. Resistance. He disassembled the connection and found green corrosion hidden between 2 flat copper faces. After cleaning and coating them, he tried again. The starters turned faster. Oil pressure reached 12 pounds while cranking. Fuel appeared at injector line 1, then 2, then 3. 4 remained dry. Daniel bled the line again. Nothing. He traced it back to the fuel manifold. A check fitting had been installed backward, its tiny arrow hidden against the block. It was too old to be part of Wade's sabotage. It was one more ordinary mistake, layered into the engine's reputation as dead. Someone years ago had fought a no-fuel cylinder, moved parts, and never finished the diagnosis. Daniel reversed the fitting. On the next crank, fuel pulsed from line 4, then 5, then 6. Caleb tightened each line to Daniel's hand signal. All 6 were wet with clean diesel. All 6 rocker feeds had oil. The emergency rack returned to stop. Cooling water moved through the tanks. The engine had compression, air, fuel, lubrication, and a way to shut down. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine the sound. "Can we start it now?" Caleb asked. Daniel checked the time. 7 Sunday evening. 17 hours remained. Not in the dark. We inspect everything once more, seal it, and start in daylight with the fire crew present. Groans rose from the people who had waited all day. Daniel faced them. "If anybody came to see me gamble a boat and a life for a noise, you came to the wrong pier." The groans ended. Corinne studied him from beneath the wheelhouse light. "The television crew will be here at 10. The engine doesn't know television. My steel barge reaches the channel at 12:40. Then 10 gives us time to test and clear the berth." They agreed on 10. Daniel and Caleb made the final inspection together. Caleb read each item from the log. Oil level, coolant level, fuel valves, return path, rack travel, emergency stop, starter isolation, exhaust clear, transmission neutral, shaft area clear, dock lines doubled, fire extinguishers charged, absorbent pads placed, people outside marked boundaries. At the bottom of the list, Caleb had added one item: hinge pins secured. Daniel looked at him. "Nobody gets around the paint twice," Caleb said. Daniel secured both pins with new retainers. Then they sealed the hatch under Len's camera and went home. At home, Caleb fell asleep over his soup. As Daniel carried him to the couch, the boy murmured, "Grandpa said old diesels tell the truth by the third crank." Daniel remembered. His father had meant that by a third honest attempt, a mechanic should have learned enough to stop blaming the machine. At midnight, Daniel sat beside the mortgage envelope and the repair receipts. Winning Maribel had created a steel responsibility, not easy money. He could sell her, pay the bank, and return to ordinary jobs. Then he opened Caleb's log. It held pressures, temperatures, mistakes corrected, temporary repairs labeled, and one sentence in the boy's hand. Never hide the thing that tells you whether your safety system is alive. Daniel knew what the tug could become if it ran. Not a trophy, but a place where a kid could hold a light, hear a real engine, and learn that working with his hands did not mean surrendering his mind. Monday morning arrived clear and cold. By 8, Port Barlow's fishing fleet seemed to have moved on to Pier 6. Pickup trucks lined Dock Street. Welders in Vail Atlantic coveralls stood behind the barricade. Retired captains occupied folding chairs. The county fire crew positioned an engine near the gate. Len controlled the access list. The marine insurer checked the temporary cooling loop and fire equipment. Corinne arrived at 9:30 with her attorney, board chair, and the local station. Wade Pike was absent. The signed transfer acknowledgement sat in Corinne's folder. The $75,000 payment was due within 10 business days. None of that mattered to the crowd as much as the old green engine beneath the deck. At 9:55, Daniel removed the seals. They were intact. He and Caleb went below. Daniel wore ear protection and a clear face shield. Caleb wore the same and stood behind a painted safety line beside the manual emergency trip. Gus watched the cooling return. Len stood at the top of the hatch. The insurer held the test sheet. Daniel turned the engine by hand, through one last full revolution. Nothing struck, nothing scraped. He opened the indicator cocks briefly to confirm no liquid sat in a cylinder, then closed them. He checked neutral at the marine gear both by lever position and by shaft freedom. He primed fuel until the return ran clear. He pre-lubed the engine to 12 pounds. Corinne leaned over the hatch. 10 o'clock. Daniel looked at Caleb. "What makes us stop?" "No oil pressure. No cooling return. Rack doesn't answer. Fuel leak. Bad knock. One exhaust temperature runs away. Anything we can't explain." "Good." Daniel set the governor at low idle. He held the emergency stop once more, then released it. The first crank began. Both starters engaged with a heavy metallic whine. The flywheel rolled. The engine made one uneven cough through the exhaust and blew a nest of rust flakes from the stack. Daniel released the button after 8 seconds. The crowd reacted to the cough, but he did not. He checked the oil gauge, 11 pounds while cranking. He checked the clear filters. A chain of tiny bubbles moved through the coarse filter. Air remained somewhere on the suction side. He traced each fitting with 2 fingers and found clean diesel dampness around the hand primer spindle. Its packing had dried out. Under cranking suction, it admitted air. Corinne called down, "Was that one?" Daniel did not answer. He tightened the packing nut one flat, worked the primer, and watched the bubbles shrink. He waited 2 full minutes for the starters to cool. The second crank turned faster. 2 cylinders fired, then a third. The engine struck 3 hard beats and nearly caught. White smoke rolled from the stack, sharp with unburned fuel. Daniel released the starter. He checked exhaust temperatures. Cylinders 1, 2, and 5 had warmed. 4 remained cold. 6 was barely above ambient. Not enough fuel at the rear pair. He inspected the governor rack travel. The linkage stopped 1/8 of an inch before the marked low idle position. The new shutdown cable was adjusted too tightly. It returned every rack safely to 0, but it also prevented full starting fuel. Daniel had created the fault himself. He said it aloud. "Shutdown cable adjustment is short. My error." The admission carried up the hatch and across the pier. Corinne stared at him. Men in the crowd did not jeer. Every mechanic there had made an adjustment that needed adjustment. The difference was whether a man hit it or corrected it. Daniel lengthened the clevis by 2 turns, then repeated the shutdown test. All 6 racks reached low idle fuel and still snapped fully to stop when Caleb pulled the trip. Oil level held, coolant held. The return stream from the temporary tanks ran strong. No fuel leaked. The starters had cooled. 10:12. "Third crank," Caleb said. Daniel laid one hand on the valve cover. It was not affection. It was another sensor. He pressed the starter buttons. The flywheel rolled once. A cylinder fired. It rolled again. 3 cylinders answered. On the third revolution, the Detroit caught all the way across the block. The sound did not rise like a modern engine. It arrived like a row of iron doors slamming in sequence. Black smoke punched from the stack, then turned gray. The engine stumbled at 400 revolutions, recovered, and settled into a deep 2-stroke hammer that shook rust from the overhead beams and sent a ring of ripples across the water beside the hull. Daniel's eyes moved, not to the crowd, but to the gauges. Oil pressure climbed through 20, then 38 pounds. Cooling water returned to the tank in a clear, steady stream. Caleb read the exhaust temperatures as Daniel pointed. 1. Rising. 2. Rising. 3. Rising. 4. Slow but climbing. 5. Rising. 6. Rising. The governor held 500 revolutions without hunting. No fuel sprayed. No bearing knocked. The blower whine stayed even beneath the exhaust bark. Above them, Port Barlow erupted. Fishermen pounded the rail. Vail Atlantic welders struck gloved hands against steel barricades. The fire crew grinned. Gus stood beside the cooling tank with water splashing his boots, laughing so hard he nearly forgot to watch the flow. Corinne did not move. Daniel raised one finger. The test was not finished. At 2 minutes, he used the infrared thermometer again. Cylinder 4 was 70 degrees cooler than the others, but still gaining. The carboned exhaust valve was beginning to seat as heat moved through it. Daniel did not raise speed. At 5 minutes, oil pressure held at 35. Coolant reached 120 degrees. The repaired cooler stayed dry. The temporary mount held alignment. The blower housing warmed evenly. At 8 minutes, cylinder 4 came within 30 degrees of its neighbors. At 10 minutes, Daniel nodded to the insurer. She marked idle test complete. One step remained. The marine gear had not moved in 17 years. Daniel had inspected its oil, linkage, and shaft, but the agreement required a head idle against double dock lines. If the clutch seized, the shaft could engage harshly. If a line failed, Maribel could surge into the pier. Daniel had set 2 spring lines, 2 breast lines, and wheel chocks against the fenders. Gus and Len cleared every person from the bite of every rope. Corinne called from above, "You already proved the engine starts." Daniel looked up. "You wrote the test." For the first time since Friday, her voice held no mockery. "I am telling you the steel delivery can wait. This isn't for the delivery." He stationed Caleb at the shutdown. Then he climbed to the wheelhouse, leaving Gus at the engine room gauges with the insurer. The old brass throttle felt stiff beneath his palm. The gear lever stood in neutral. Daniel sounded one short blast on a portable air horn. He moved the lever toward a head. Halfway, it stopped. The crowd leaned as one body. Daniel did not force it. He brought it back to neutral and went below. The linkage pivot at the gear case moved, but the final selector shaft did not. Old grease had hardened inside its detent housing. He cleaned the exposed shaft and warmed the housing gradually with hot water from the cooling return, never with a torch near fuel. Then he worked the lever through a 1/4 inch at a time. The selector moved. He returned to the wheelhouse. Second short blast. This time, the lever crossed the detent. The marine gear engaged with a low clunk. The shaft began to turn. Water boiled behind Maribel's stern. The first spring line tightened, fibers rising beneath its wet surface. Then, the second took load. The tug pressed forward against the fenders, not fast, not free, but alive under her own engine. The insurer started her stopwatch. 30 seconds. Oil pressure steady. 60 seconds. Cooling return steady. 90 seconds. The shaft turned without a grinding bearing or violent vibration. Daniel kept the engine at a head idle. He did not need drama from the throttle. A measurable load was enough. At 2 minutes, the insurer raised her hand. Test complete. Daniel shifted to neutral. The propeller wash subsided. Maribel settled against her lines while the 6 to 110 continued its iron rhythm. Then Daniel gave Caleb the nod. The boy pulled the emergency shutdown. All 6 racks snapped to no fuel. The engine stopped cleanly. The sudden absence of its hammering note made the gulls audible again. That clean stop earned a different reaction from the mechanics. Not an explosion of cheering, but a deep chorus of approval. Starting had proved Daniel could wake the engine. Stopping had proved he had respected it. The insurer climbed to the pier and signed the sheet. Engine start, 10-minute idle, cooling flow, oil pressure, a head engagement, and controlled shutdown, all conditions met. Len read the result over the harbor loudspeaker. Corinne stood before her employees with the transfer folder in her hands. On Friday, she had used the same platform to price Daniel's judgment at a birth bill and a public confession. Now, the people on the pier looked past her toward him. She could have retreated into the office. Instead, she walked down the gangway. Daniel met her beside the engine hatch. Caleb stood on his other side, holding the log. Corinne handed Daniel the signed transfer acknowledgement. "Maribel is yours for $1, she said. "The $75,000 will be paid under the interference clause." Daniel accepted the folder. She turned toward the crowd, but when she spoke, she looked at Vail Atlantic's welders. "I created a wager to make a point about an obsolete vessel. Mr. Mercer made the point instead. My employee interfered with his work while acting under my authority. Whether I gave that specific order or failed to prevent what I had encouraged, the responsibility is mine." It was not a perfect apology. It did not restore the 5 lost Marine jobs or erase the threat to Daniel's lease, but it was specific, public, and costly. Corinne faced him again. "Your shop lease will be offered for 5 years at its present rate, with harbor access restored. No condition that you work for Vail Atlantic." Daniel heard Caleb inhale. "Put it in writing," he said. Laughter moved through the crowd. Even Corinne gave a tired half-smile. "I expected that." The steel barge entered the channel at 12:40. By then, Maribel's engine had cooled, her temporary systems had been disconnected, and Gus's lobster boat had a line on her bow. Len guided the shift from Pier 6 to the East Harbor Wall. Daniel did not pretend the tug could tow or navigate under her own power. The seacock, hull bed, steering gear, shaft seals, wiring, and fire system all required proper repair and inspection. But as Maribel moved across the basin, every boat in Port Barlow sounded one short horn. 3 months later, snow lay against the windows of Mercer, Marine, and Auto. The mortgage was current. The delivery van had gone home with its rebuilt transmission. A new 5-year lease hung in a plain frame beside the office door, read by Daniel and Caleb twice before either signed. Maribel rested inside an old net shed loaned by the Fishermen's Cooperative. Her engine had been cleaned but not polished. Daniel left the scars visible. The failed cooler tube was replaced with a rebuilt bundle. Certified welders renewed the corroded bed rail. The raw water seacock and through hull were replaced while the tug was hauled out. The shaft bearings, steering, alarms, bilge pumps, and fire suppression were repaired or renewed under survey. The $75,000 did not turn the tug into a luxury restoration. It paid for safe steel, insurance, and the first year of a training program called Maribel Works. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, 6 teenagers from Port Barlow High came aboard in safety glasses and work clothes. They learned to label what they removed, to measure before cutting, to distinguish a temporary test repair from a service repair, and to say, "I don't know yet," without shame. Corinne funded 2 apprenticeships at the program, but Daniel required the money to pass through the Fishermen's Cooperative. No advertising banners, no ownership language, no child owed Vail Atlantic a job. She agreed. On the first public class, Caleb stood beside the 6 to 110 with the spiral log in his hand. He showed a 12-year-old girl how the shutdown rack moved all 6 injectors together. He did not touch the controls for her. He asked what she thought would happen, then let her test the linkage with the engine secured. Daniel watched from the workbench. Gus leaned beside him. "You going to tell them it fired on the 3rd crank? They already know. Whole town tells it wrong twice a day. Makes a good story." Daniel looked at the engine. The starting was the short part. Across the shed, Caleb pulled the emergency handle. 6 racks snapped shut with one clean mechanical click. He turned to the students. "That sound matters more than the first smoke. If you can't stop it, you don't start it." Daniel said nothing. He only picked up the next injector, set it on the clean cloth between them, and switched on the work light.